Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture we're just going to summarize what we've learnt in the application section of our course. So let's start with SQS, and this is pretty much the most important service that you need to remember going into the exam. So it is worth reading the FAQs on SQS and having a good idea of how SQS works. So SQS is a web service that gives you access to message queues that can be used to store messages while waiting for a computer to process them. So we use the example of, you're running a website that generates memes, as and when someone uploads an image, that will then trigger an SQS message, and then you've got your application servers who pull down that message. They will then, encode the memes, for example, and then once that's done, they might then store them in an S3 bucket and then delete that message from the queue. So it's quite important to remember a few things about SQS going into the exam. It definitely does not offer first in, first out. If you need any kind of sequencing, you're going to need to build that into your SQS messaging system, but messages can be delivered completely randomly. There's a 12-hour visibility timeout window on the messages by default, and Amazon SQS is engineered to provide at least once delivery of all messages in its queue, although most of the time each messages will be delivered to your application exactly once. You should design your system so that processing a message more than once does not create any errors or inconsistencies. Some more exam tips. The messages are 256 kilobytes in size. It's built at 64 kilobyte chunks, and a 256 kilobyte message will be basically 4 64 kilobyte chunks. One last thing I wanted to talk to you about just around SQS is, we talked about not getting first in, first out service. You can't prioritize messages. So if you need a message that has a higher priority than another message, what you should look at doing is using multiple SQS queues. That's the best way to do it, rather than saying, okay, this message is more important than the other one. So if you've got an application maybe where someone is paying a premium, so they're a subscriber of your website, and when they upload a meme to that website and generate that meme, they should have priority. It should be available to them immediately, whereas if somebody else is just a normal member or anonymous member, they have a less of a priority. You would architect that using two SQS queues, and you design your application to poll the premium SQS queue first, and then it would poll the secondary SQS queue once that premium queue was empty. So that can actually come up as a scenario, certainly in the professional level exam, but just bear that in mind going into the associate as well, which is you can't prioritize messages. If you want to do that, you're going to need multiple SQS queues. Moving on to simple workflow service, and really where you're going to be tested on this is two areas. One is comparing it to SQS. So SQS has a retention period of 14 days, whereas simple workflow service has a retention period for up to a year for workflow executions. Simple workflow service presents a task-orientated API, whereas SQS is a message-orientated API. So again, just remember that example I gave you with simple workflow service where humans can be involved, and Amazon really do use simple workflow service to fulfill orders. So when you place an order on Amazon.com, this is using SWF, as a means of managing that order and getting somebody to go and find that hammer in that warehouse and then deliver it to the packing area, etc., etc. And also remember that simple workflow service ensures that a task is assigned only once and is never duplicated. With SQS, you need to be able to handle duplicate messages, and may also need to ensure that a message is processed only once. Simple workflow service also keeps tracks of all tasks and event in an application, whereas SQS, you need to implement your own application level tracking, especially if your application uses multiple queues. The other important thing to remember about simple workflow service is just the 3 different types of actors. You might be asked to identify these different types of actors in a multiple choice questions, and you have to choose 3 out of 4. So the first one is always a workflow starter. Trigger, and this is an application that can initiate or start a workflow. It could be your e-commerce website when placing an order or a mobile app when searching for a bus time, for example. Then we have our deciders, and they're basically controlling the flow of activity tasks in a workflow execution. So, did the person's credit card details go through? Have they selected the right address? Is this a verified address? If it's not a verified address, then do this. Think of a workflow decider as basically an if-then decider in your application logic. So if something has finished in a workflow or fails, the decider is going to decide what to do next. We then have our activity workers, and they actually go in and carry out the activity task, and these could be humans. This could be the guy in the warehouse going to go find that hammer. It doesn't have to be EC2 instances or scripts that you're running. So remember those three different types of actors going into the exam. Moving on to SNS, the key thing to remember are the different types of subscribers. So I could say protocols, but not all of these are protocols. So it's like HTTP, you can have HTTPS, you can send out SNS messages through email with JSON, you can send it into an SQS queue, you can send it to your applications, and you can even use it to trigger a Lambda function. So remember, in the lab we created a topic, and then we added subscribers to the topic, and then we choose what those subscribers were by selecting the protocol. So you should know these different protocols going into the exam, because you may be asked in a multiple choice question to choose the three protocols that SNS supports. So just remember those going into the exam. The other thing you should realize is the difference between SNS versus SQS. Again, they like to compare SQS with every other application service, though technically SNS is now a mobile service, not an application service, but the exam will ask you to compare the two. So remember that they're both messaging services in AWS. SNS is a push-based system, so when you send something to a topic, it's pushed out, it goes to SQS, it goes to your HTTP endpoints, it goes to your email, it goes to your phone, whereas a SQS polls, so a message sits in the SQS queue, and you've got to have like an EC2 instance pulling the data down. So that's the difference. SNS is push, SQS is basically a pull service. And then finally, Elastic Transcoder, we covered it off. It's a media transcoder in the cloud. It allows you to convert media files from their original source format into different formats that will play on smartphones, tablets, PCs, etc. It provides transcoding presets for popular output formats, which means that you don't have to guess about which setting works best for a particular device. And the way you pay for it is based on the minutes that you spend transcoding and the resolution at which you transcode. And I gave the example, we at A Cloud Guru use this all the time when we are uploading new videos to our site. So that's it, guys. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next section. Thank you.